Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is Lawpod.
Welcome to Criminology Matters, the criminological podcast series in conjunction with Lawpod. And today we have Professor Graham Ellison from the School of Law and Dr. Caoimhe Dhónaill from the School of History, Anthropology and Politics. And they're here today to talk about this new report that they released yesterday in conjunction with Erin Early from the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work and the Department of Justice. And this report, a review of the criminalisation of paying for sexual services in Northern Ireland, gave really the statistics, the responses from sex workers and clients and from different stakeholders. So I'll maybe start with you, Graham, and ask you to give us a sense of the context of the law that created this criminalisation and think a bit about the situation that was in Northern Ireland before this and what fed up to this introduction.
No problem, Gillian. I'll maybe start with the, I suppose, historical context to this report, but also, I suppose, to prostitution in Northern Ireland generally. It's actually quite strange because since the end of the conflict or the troubles here, that's really only when we started getting some data, and in particular the DOJ study in 2014 that preceded ours. Oddly enough, we've actually more information from the 19th century about the nature of prostitution in Belfast, because Belfast as a port city like Liverpool, Dublin or wherever, in those kinds of environments, prostitution flourishes and thrives. So there was a part of Belfast, it's mostly demolished now. I think there's just a tiny bit left, called Sailortown. Okay. And there are a number of bars and establishments around that area where sex workers used to congregate and meet sailors coming and going from the ships. And Leanne McCormick from the University of Ulster has documented that well. During the Troubles, we've had very, very little data on prostitution. There were, by all accounts, very few prosecutions for solicitation, for example. We don't really know anything. I think how commercial sex markets thrive in an atmosphere of political violence is something that needs to be studied, because we've no data. So as I say, we have lots of data from the 19th century and lots of data from 2014, but very, very little in between. I suppose what we do know is that Belfast generally had indoor sex markets to a far greater extent than other cities in the UK, because during the Troubles, it was too dangerous to use public space and solicit on the street. Plus, there was a far higher level of RUC and army surveillance. So sex workers moved indoor in Belfast from the 1970s, whereas that wouldn't have been the case, say, in Dublin or Leeds or Liverpool, Glasgow or wherever. So anyway, from 2014, that was the first time ever in the history of this jurisdiction that we've any robust empirical data collected on prostitution in Northern Ireland. That was commissioned by the Department of Justice. Caoimhe was a part of that study, and she'll maybe talk a bit about that in a second. But that threw up a number of interesting facts. For example, the first fact, I suppose, was that the bulk of prostitution here is indoor and online. Okay. And that Belfast doesn't really have a large on-street sector the way that, for example, Manchester would have. Like, I did research in Manchester a few years ago, and there were probably around 150 female sellers that were registered on the service providers' books. Okay. Belfast may have had 10 to 20, so a significantly less number. The other, I suppose, fact, if you like, is that prostitution here is globalised. Comparatively few local Northern Irish males or females sell sex.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, it's a kind of an international. We called it a smorgasbord in the report, and that resonates with the kind of phenomenon of the touring sex worker who works for a couple of days in cities. They might work in Belfast, move to Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Glasgow, and then come back to Belfast. The early research suggested that the bulk of prostitution, as we know anyway, was performed by females. Mm-hmm. Males and transgender, transsexual sex workers formed smaller numbers. So I think that's really the baseline. Oh, and I think the prevalence, they estimated that around 300 to 350 sellers are active in Northern Ireland on any one day, mostly selling from the internet. Mm-hmm. As I say, very, very few sex workers here sell on street.
Okay.
So that was the baseline, and I suppose I should say as well that we in Northern Ireland here are actually in a totally unique position globally, in the sense that we have prevalence data from before and after sex purchase legislation was introduced. So the early DOJ study was introduced before the legislation kicked in, so we have a baseline figure for that. Mm-hmm. So we were able in the current study to look back and see, has it increased, decreased, stayed the same.
So that's great. That really sets the context for what the situation was in Northern Ireland before the legislation came in place. Could you tell us a bit about why this legislation was introduced and who introduced it?
Yeah, to be honest, I was as surprised as anyone, and I actually remember the day I heard that this legislation was even being proposed. I was lying on my sofa and I heard Lord Morrow from the Democratic Unionist Party talking about prostitution. I thought this is really surprising because prostitution was not really something that had ever featured in their discourse. Yeah. So that's really what I suppose what got me interested in the topic. But the context, I suppose, was that basically you had a kind of a coalescence of figures from the religious right, mm-hmm. and they were represented by an organisation called CARE, mm-hmm. Christian Research, Action and Education. They have a branch in Belfast, but they are essentially based in London, and they do a lot of lobbying in Parliament around abortion rights, GLBT rights, and so on and so forth. You also had, I suppose, what you might call secular feminism of a particular variety represented by Women's Aid in Northern Ireland. I'm not saying for a second that Women's Aid represent the only feminism in Northern Ireland, but they do represent a strand of what's called abolitionist feminism. Mm-hmm. So you had a coalescence then of the kind of political and religious right and secular feminism who came together to campaign for this bill. The model that it's, I suppose, modelled on is called the Nordic model because it was introduced in Sweden initially in 1999 and then exported to Norway, Iceland, and subsequently France, the Republic of Ireland, and of course Northern Ireland as well. And it's quite a powerful model, and the Swedish government have attached a lot of stock in the fact that this is something that can be exported globally. So there's quite a lot of marketing around it, but that, I suppose, is the basic I suppose framework for this model. Do you want to give us a little bit of insight into the Nordic model, Caoimhe?
So the Nordic model is the criminalisation of the purchase of sex rather than the criminalisation of the selling of sex. So that's only the client who is actually going to be prosecuted, convicted, arrested if any arrests are to be made. And really the aim of that, or the purported aim of that, is to reduce demand on sex without penalising the sex worker themselves. So whenever it's so on the surface, it seemed to be very much protecting primarily women. Sex workers are primarily women, though not entirely. Is protecting women, being able to move them out of sex work without actually penalising them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So it seems like it's another aspect of carceral feminism, I guess. And I think as a prison abolitionist, there's a bit of a tension there, you know, between anti-carceral perspectives and then feminists who want to protect women through different stratas of criminalisation.
Yeah, no, I think that reference to carceral feminism is actually a good one, because we would make the argument that Northern Ireland in fact shares more with the United States in terms of its debates around prostitution than it does with England, Scotland, Wales, or indeed elsewhere in Europe, because what you've had in the United States is a kind of a linking of carceral feminism with the religious right as well, who campaign on lots of different issues for around pornography, prostitution, and so on and so forth. So that's something that we have that doesn't really happen or hasn't really happened elsewhere in the United Kingdom. Links to those kinds of debates in America, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important aspect to the manifestation of feminism in Northern Ireland, actually, because we do live in a conservative Christian patriarchy. And so what you were saying then is this feeding into the legislation that was produced.
Absolutely.
So what were the findings of this report regarding sexual offences?
Well, the study looked at the operation of Article 64A, which was what was called Clause 6 in the old bill, and that's the bit of the 2015 Human Trafficking Act that criminalises the purchase of sex. It's kind of odd because in the Northern Ireland Assembly, this was discursively presented as linking prostitution to human trafficking for sexual exploitation. But the kind of irony is that neither of the two cases that have been brought before the courts involve either prostitution or human trafficking. The first case involved a young man in a garage waving a roll of banknotes at a female cleaner who happened to be Lithuanian. There was no suggestion at all that the cleaner was a sex worker. The second case is probably a bit more serious in the sense that it involved an older male trying to pick up a school girl. And to our mind, in the report, that guy should have been prosecuted under child grooming offences, which would attract fairly significant penalties in the law. But the prosecution felt that they couldn't pin that on him because it wasn't clear that he knew the schoolgirl was under the age of 16, even though she was wearing a school uniform. So he was offered a plea. If he pleaded guilty to the Article 64 offence, he wouldn't be charged with the other, and he subsequently absconded, and no one knows where he is currently. So I think both cases, in a sense, make a mockery of any claims that this legislation was designed to eliminate either prostitution or human trafficking for sexual exploitation. The fact
can I just jump in? I don't know if you can cut this in, but just in regards to the first case, because like you said, in the first case, there was no suggestion that there was prostitution involved until the person was prosecuted under this law, at which point the cleaner was incredibly upset because a lot of people at home then thought that she actually was involved in sex work, so it actually ended up being totally counterintuitive.
I think that's a problem with this law in the sense that it can in fact stigmatise the victim. So not only is the victim victimised once by whatever behaviour, but they're also victimised twice by the assumption that they may have been selling sex, and given the stigma around that in society, that can be quite difficult to deal with, particularly if you're a 16-year-old child. The problem with an Article 64A offence is that it's basically a summary offence. It's something that is triable in a magistrate's court, and it doesn't involve a huge fine. But there is a prison sentence can be attached, but nothing like, for example, you would be sentenced to in a higher court.
Okay, thanks for that. So, not too much outcome statistically from this legislation. As you mentioned with that case, what we're saying then is the continuation of stigmatisation of sex workers. So while sort of this carceral feminist Nordic approach maybe claims to centre women's needs, it does nothing to destigmatise or to remove the sort of shaming that we have around sex work. Caoimhe, I might bring you in to unpack this a bit and to unpack the findings a bit more. You held interviews with sex workers. What were the sort of experiences that they were having as an outcome of this legislation?
So a number of things I can say around that. I think one of the things that is important that Graham had sort of referred to earlier is the fact that we're the only jurisdiction that has research from before and research after. And sex workers were obviously spoken to before the legislation was brought in. And during that research, the 2014 research, 98% of sex workers had said that this would have a detrimental effect on their lives, that it wouldn't reduce demand and that it would make them more vulnerable to abuse, more vulnerable to stigmatisation. And what we found on the other end is in this review is that that's exactly what happened. The voices of sex workers were 100% right. Mm-hmm. But yes, I interviewed sex workers as part of this research, and I interviewed a very broad spectrum. Women, men, members of the LGBT community, trans workers, non-binary workers, from teens, from students, to people in their 50s. People who'd worked before the legislation, people who'd worked afterwards. And for those who were working before the legislation came in and those who were working after, there's a number had said there's a very distinct point at which clients became more abusive, and that was the bringing in of legislation. And absolutely link this sort of more abusive client to that. What they were telling me is that because clients are now seeing themselves as taking the risk, they're the people who are in danger of being prosecuted or convicted, they are demanding or pressuring sex workers into less safe sexual practices, demanding that they do things that they maybe didn't offer, provide services they didn't offer previously, meet them in places that they're uncomfortable with. Sex workers now can't say, come to my house anymore. Clients will say, I'm the one taking the risk. I can't be seen going to a prostitute's house, you have to come to me, which is much less safe. They've become more abusive. A number of the sex workers were telling me that since laws come in, they're getting constant barrages of text messages, of phone calls, totally abusing them. And the statistical side of the research has shown, so our statistics are showing that sex workers by and large are finding this. Clients by and large are not finding a massive amount of difference to ability to purchase sex. Most clients said that there's been no real difference in ability to purchase sex than before. So while the law is on the surface meant to be reducing demand without penalising sex workers, what we find is no reduction in demand, and sex workers then they're significantly more stigmatised.
Did it impact the relationship between sex workers and policing?
I think that in terms of policing, the PSNI, I suppose to their credit in some respects, have actually followed the National Police Chiefs Council guidelines and have appointed 2, increasing to 3 sex work liaison officers who have a kind of responsibility around harm reduction and not enforcement. So if individual sex workers are feeling, if they're threatened or whatever, they can call upon these officers who will go out, not with the aim of prosecuting them for something or assuming that they're trafficked or whatever, but will try and assist, I suppose. I think what we're probably finding, and certainly what the sex worker survey threw up, is that still an overwhelming, I wouldn't say a majority, but I'd say around half the sample of sex workers are still reluctant to report a crime to the police. And they fear, first of all, they fear that the police may inadvertently out them even though the police may not necessarily intend to do that. They may say something, they may call a landlord or something, and they will be outed. They feel that they may not necessarily be believed. If they're a migrant sex worker, they may feel that their immigration status, I suppose, could be quite legitimately checked, but they could be potentially deported. So there are lots of reasons for the non-reporting to the police, but I would have to say that out of all the statutory agencies in Northern Ireland, it's the PSNI that have made the most moves to attempting to actually engage with sex workers. Like the Department of Health have published a leaving prostitution strategy, but there's nothing in it. All it does is point people to various existing
and again,
providers.
It's focused on escape and
still got that narrative of protectionism and trying to protect. One of the things as well, just in regards to the police and the Department of Public Prosecutions, is they talked about it before the law came in. They talked about it since, is that it's a very difficult law to actually prosecute, because there tends to be no complainant.
Yep.
If you're two people in an apartment, in a hotel, consensually exchanging sex and exchanging money, there's no person who's going to report that law. So the police have sort of said to us in the past, and the Department of Public Prosecutions has said it's very hard to police. And to put police time towards it and police money and police resources for something that nobody's actually feeling a crime is being committed is quite problematic in and of itself.
Absolutely. You mentioned migrant sex workers, and of course this legislation was sort of two parts and entailed this sort of enmeshed legislation with regards to human trafficking, and we see a lot of conflation between migrant sex work and human trafficking. What were your findings with regards to that?
I think I think it's well enough established in, I suppose, academic discourses around human trafficking that to a large extent they have emerged because of fears or concerns around immigration, and that human trafficking is a way of policing immigration by another means. And if you look, for example, at the first responders who respond to what's called the National Referral Mechanism in Northern Ireland or anywhere else in the UK, it's the police and the Immigration Service. So that, I suppose, resonates with other work that has been done, but certainly in the larger quantitative study we did, we recorded, I think there were 100 nationalities of sex worker recorded. Not all of them were selling sex as much as the next grouping or whatever, but it is an international, as I say, smorgasbord, and there are lots of reasons for that. The Irish economy in the Republic, for example, is doing very well. It attracts migrants in. The Northern Ireland, as a region of the UK, is seen as a kind of a go-to destination as well. But there are comparatively few Indigenous sex workers here, oddly enough, and I think has impacts for any kind of prostitution strategy, because a lot of these people don't necessarily want to exit. They will exit at some point when they go home, and that's what the research tells us, that migrant sex workers don't sell sex forever. They do it for short periods of time, then go home. What it is putting demands on, I think, or will put demands on in the future, is provision of sexual health advice and services, because that's one area that we don't really have a lot of support for. There is the Belfast Commercial Sex Worker Service that runs a drop-in every Thursday, but that historically had more to do with the street sector. But they were telling us that online sellers have different needs and priorities, and this is something I think that could become a public health issue down the line if it's not addressed.
Okay.
And we think, and I don't know if this is a dirty word, and I don't know if you thought you'd get away with not talking about Brexit, but I do think that Brexit will have an implication in regards to the international sellers, because what a lot of the sex workers who are migrant sex workers tend to travel across the border because the border is fluid at the minute, and you'll find, they'll do a few days in Dublin and a few days elsewhere and then come to Belfast. And I think there is a big space for a piece of research on what the implications of if there is a border put up in regards to migrant sex workers travelling, because of course then you have conversations about immigration status, etc.
Of course, so Anti-Deportation Now and Committee for Administration of Justice have been recording the amount of stop and search that foreign nationals have on the border already.
So I think there could well be quite a distinct implications for travelling and touring sex workers, because especially if it is people of questionable status, the idea of crossing a border that would be stop and search probably will stop that particular...
Would be off-putting. And I guess the statistics from your research really backed up this idea, because how many arrests were there with regards to the Human Trafficking Act?
It's less than 35. It's 30 or 31.
It is in fact 31.
Points for Caoimhe.
Caoimhe was paying attention. Yeah. But I think the bigger issue for us here is that, and the not the last Justice Minister, the one before that, David Ford, I think he pointed this out at the time. We in Northern Ireland currently have a piece of legislation, and this is the only example I can think of anywhere that this has happened, a piece of legislation that the police expressed concerns about, and they had to enforce it, that the Public Prosecution Service expressed concerns about, who had to prosecute it, and the Department of Justice expressed concerns about because they had to implement it. So you have three organs of state with collective wisdom and experience of legislation, all expressing concerns about this legislation, but it was implemented anyway. So I think people's emotions and their hearts overruled their actual heads in terms of the way this was voted for. It was like, community policing, which is something I've also researched. It's just seen as a good thing. But whenever you sort of look at it and deconstruct it, it actually means very little, to be honest. It can mean anything you want it to mean.
But I suppose in a sense that's a bit like, I'm sure you come across this a lot, Gillian, as you say, as a prison abolitionist, there's a what feels like a logical argument where people go, you do bad things, you go to prison, and that's going to be off-putting, and therefore that will work. And you kind of have to, you would have to challenge that by going, actually, well, here are alternates. And I think with this legislation, I don't think there are any hearts in the wrong place. I think that it was looked at, the Nordic model was looked at, and they were going, well, this is going to be great because it's going to be beneficial to the women and the men who are women, men, transgender people who are in sex work, and it's only going to be criminalising clients. And it feels logical, like community policing, it feels logical. But when you look at the actual results, we're not seeing the impact that was expected, except if you were listening to sex workers who've told us this is exactly what was going to happen.
Absolutely. And so it seems like all the experts, the criminal justice experts, the researchers, the sex workers, what they felt would work was set to the side, and this sort of moralistic vision was enacted instead.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say...
Too strong?
I don't know. Well, I think it depends on what side of the kind of debate you're coming from. I think the issue here was that you had two groups. You had secular feminists on the one hand, and the kind of religious right on the other, who object to prostitution, albeit for very different reasons. They don't even agree on why they sort of, are agree on it in a sense. And no one is really. And once you start unpicking that, the whole thing falls apart.
I think that we're running out of time now. So I might ask you then to tell me a bit about what your vision for a societal response to sex work would be. What would improve things?
I don't think that anything is going to change here, because I don't think there's the political will to engage with this topic, because the politicians don't want to talk or about prostitution or human trafficking because they don't want to appear soft on it. So I think we're just going to potter along with this law. It may end up like other laws that are antiquated, they just end up not being enforced,
Yeah.
but still on the statute books.
But that puts Northern Ireland in such an interesting place because, like you've said a few times, we're the only place on earth that has put in the Nordic model that has research from before and research from after to say, let's see what's happened. And this research has been done, but I don't think there's going to be any change here, which just puts us in this very weird
Yeah, and I
position.
think, like, in terms of the media exposure around the review itself, a lot of that has in fact been positive, but there have been some negative stuff. But the negative reports haven't actually focused on the results.
Yeah.
They've tried to attack the credibility of the research team, pick holes in the methodology and whatever. But the reality is, across 4 separate sources, that advertising and the supply of prostitution services has increased.
Yeah.
And even sex workers noted that they noticed a huge surge in business. That
was one of the things I found really fascinating around the research, was that at the time of bringing in the legislation in 2015, because there was so much media around it, and the negative media around sex work, which is where some of the stigmatisation comes from, but there was a huge surge in demand for sex work. So actually what the law did was it increased demand for sex work at that time, a huge surge, and it has tailed off because there was the particular media interest.
Yeah.
But overall we've seen about a 5-6% increase in adverts.
On one particular website was a 5% increase, but that increase was noted by sex workers. It was noted as well in our data scrape of other, and 75% of clients now purchase sex online, whereas only 50% did in the earlier research. So there's been a definite move to online.
There was a particular website.
Markets.
Yeah. There's a particular website that there was a media report about around the time of the legislation. I can't remember off the top of my head which website it was, but it was put into an article in one of the local newspapers, and they in particular said they saw, well, sex workers who advertised on this particular website said that after that article there was a huge increase, and that was an article that was saying this is terrible and don't look at this because it's awful, and basically people read the article.
Yeah, but I think that works two ways. It's not just for people who want to purchase sexual services, it's also for people who want to sell as well, because publicising the idea of prostitution can work for sellers and buyers, because it can introduce women and men who maybe want a bit of extra money for school fees or university fees.
Absolutely.
Or whatever. And it was kind of interesting as well, but there are similar results in England, that around 20% of our sample who did the actual survey were students, either part-time or full-time, and using the income from sex work to supplement their or pay for their fees or whatever. But a lot of possibly single females were saying that it's a flexible work environment, and no one's saying it's perfect, and we certainly didn't say that in the report, and we have highlighted the potentially abusive nature of prostitution, but I think it's a big complex picture that's been really in danger of being oversimplified.
Okay, and this legislation hasn't really done anything to change or help?
Certainly not help.
Okay.
No, I think it's problematised a whole raft of areas that were already problematic. So it's actually made it even worse, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Lawpod, an informed take on current events brought to you by the law students and staff at Queen's University Belfast. Our theme music is by Colonel Chocolate and the Justice Triangle, and Lawpod is funded by Queen's Law School and the Queen's Annual Fund. You can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter @QBLawpod. For more information, you can also visit our website, lawpod.org, and please have a look in the show notes for more information about the topics covered today. You can find us on iTunes or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and this was Lawpod.